Okay, good morning. We're up to Beis, volume 2, volume 3, page 1210. 1210. So after explaining the first few pages of this new volume, the addition, this Chassidus, as he calls it, what the new dimension of divine unity that Ayin reveals. In other words, after it says, Ki Havaya hu Elikim, which is revealing how Havaya and Elikim are one, and the Elikim, the concealment, is revealing the revelation that the concealment is really part of the revelation of Havaya, and both B'Shamayim and Mal, the habligvul, which is the transcendent infinite energy, and the Hagvul, ala oretz mitachas, the divine within existence. In the words of earlier Maimorim, the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti and the Ayin of Yesh HaNivra, the divine within the Yesh, the Ayin, the divine that vivifies the Yesh HaNivra, the created reality, and the Ayin that is bottled and completely nullified in the presence of the Yesh HaMiti. So then it comes Ayin. And Ayin introduces that Elikim itself, the very concealment, because the letters, Malchus, the moon, the letters, the Kalim, they themselves reveal the divine power of the Koyach HaHelam, the Koyach HaGvul that created them. Or as he says, how the body itself is Elikus, which will be revealed in the future. And this is exclusive to the future, because this is a level where the moon or Malchus goes higher than Zah. Not just that it's equal to, and not just that it's like the sun, similar to the way it was in the beginning of creation, or even a little higher level, but still all about revelation, a light, an illuminated moon. But it's here how the very concealed part of the moon rises to a place, a completely new level where it's actually higher than, and mashpia transmits to Zah and to the Oyer itself. Like he says, the guf, the neshama, the soul will receive its energy, vitality from the body. Top of page 1210 I just read. It doesn't say the words, but if you use the words of Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra and the Ayin of Yesh HaMiti, that the Yesh HaNivra, it itself reveals the Yesh HaMiti. And not the Ayin. The Ayin is Oyer, is a state of Oyer. The reason it's called Ayin, as we learned, it's either because it's nullified and completely bottled to the source, or because we don't understand it, and it's not like our existence. We don't feel it. But now we're talking that the very Yesh itself, and I'm just saying those words. The Rebbe Rashab did not say Yesh HaMiti, Yesh HaNivra. He might say it later, but it's another Maimorim. It says it's pretty clear. He's talking about that as well. That the letters themselves, the very letters which that brings creation, the Chemer, the very body of creation, that itself will reveal, like he says, the last line in the chapter and the paragraph from page 1210. Zeu is Chassidus in the Ayin, the b'chinas hahelam atzmei, b'chinas erv gili. The concealment itself will be in a state of er and gili. Olam. Yeah, chalol shel olam, as he said. Ayin. Okay, that was that. But we continued. We learned after that as well. And that of course, redeems the last, so to speak, the last aspect, that where unity of the divine is so complete that it accounts even for the concealment itself. Not just that concealment leads to revelation, that it itself also will be seen in its true light of what it really is, the power of God to conceal, to limit, and so on. So, to be the Indian, he started, we learned, to explain this, introduced, he went now going to a new sugya, a new subject, not new in the sense, it's of course obviously going to explain this idea, but new material. And Havaya, the posuk Havaya Yechatu Merivov. I looked up Yechatu means annihilate, but also sometimes used to shatter. Sometimes it used to destroy. There's different words Yechatu comes from. But essentially, it's talking about God eliminating or shattering Meriva of his enemies, his foes. Okay, and he brings, like you mentioned, he does not bring the one word. He just says Olam b'shamayim, Yirayim, that he thunders against them from heaven. And then the second half of the verse is a positive. V'yitin eiz, and he fortifies or gives strength to his king. V'yorim keren mishichi, and he lifts up. The keren here literally means the horn. Even though keren also could be light, but the horn of Mashiach, because as we said, the keren Mashiach, the horn refers to the way he is anointed, the keren. So he asks a few questions, which I'll just briefly repeat. What's the connection between the first half and the second half? And what is the two statements that he gives strength to his king and exalts or lifts up and raises the keren, the horn of the Mashiach. Also, what's this Havaya Yechatu? Which would indicate that if he's higher than, he's able to shatter the enemy. Where we see that Havaya sometimes is used in the context of Ish Milchama, that God is a warrior. So that means he's engages in the battle. When you say someone can be victorious, it means they have a stronger power than their enemy. When you say Hashem Havaya Ish Milchama, so he explains. And additionally, there's another point that they are opposing Havaya. So how could Havaya itself shatter them? So he explained there's two levels of Havaya. There's a level of Havaya that engages in battle, that's Havaya de Latata. Whereas here, when you talk about Yechat and Merivav, that he shatters his enemies, you're talking about Havaya de La'ela. Like we learned earlier, Shamayim Emal, Havaya de La'ela. Yeah. So Havaya de Latata is Shem Havaya de Zah, and that's Ish, because Ish is already a structure, like a human structure, not obviously physical, but the structure of Zah, which is structured, we're structured in its image. Zah is basically the structure of the midas of the divine faculties. But Shem Havaya is not shaykh to Mulchama. Adrabah Misham Nimshel v'chol Eva v'yichares. But with the higher Havaya, that attack is not shaykh to Mulchama. That is above. And on the contrary, from that comes the power to cut off and eliminate, like he says, cut us from the word kesed. So kesed comes from a higher state that cuts off and eliminates and annihilates the enemy. That's why Havaya is with the comments in Malshinim. Okay. Now he continues. This is all we learned. I'm just summing up. He says that's Havaya Yechatu Mirivov. That from Havaya Del Eila comes this ability Yechatu to annihilate or to shatter. And why does it say Mirivov, his enemies? That sounds like because they're opposing Havaya, which would seem to be they're opposing Havaya Del Eila. So he says, and yet he eliminates them, which means he's higher than them. He says that will be explained with the God's help later. So he doesn't go into that aspect yet. We'll talk about that.
What is
the way he concludes.
Where's the comments of Ramal Shinim?
I didn't look it up. I thought maybe some of you would, but I didn't have a chance to look it up. Does anybody has a siddur in front of them with the Kudus? You know what? Let me look right here. I do know that the Mashinim is connected. Remember, this is the whole pasuk, by the way, Havaya Yechatu Merivav, is said in Tfilas Chana. It's the end of prayer of Chana, and she's referring to David HaMelech. And then from her come the 9 different statements in Rosh Hashanah's davening that are connected to these 9, and they say Mashinim is connected to the Havaya Yechatu Merivav. That's in the Gemara. But let me just, since we're already asking me, let me look it up already if I can, if I may. I didn't look inside the Svarim, but let me see if there's
I'm
something we see.
interesting because there is only one Havaya in the bracha.
Yeah, yeah. Well, here it says, "Kol evi amcha meheri charesu," that he does bring. Yeah. Okay, I don't see anything right here. I have to look it up. I'll let you know what I find. Okay. Maybe there's something in Kisvei Arizal and the Kavonis, maybe. Okay. Anyway, continuing on. I think this is where we stopped, if I recall correctly. So I'm going to continue from here. The line is neged Havaya, the parentheses, then he says, and according to this, that we now said Havaya Yechatu Merivov is coming from the Havaya de Le'ela, a higher power. So according to this, you have to say the Ikerin Yezeh, this level, the primary, basically elimination of enemies, of God's enemies, will be la'asid. Zeyeh la'asid. Will be in the future. So Ozir Gilishem Havaya de Le'ela, because then will be the revelation of this higher level of Havaya, which of course is consistent. Well, I don't want to say anything yet because I'm not sure how he's going to connect it to Ayin, but we'll see. So the Gemara says that even though there are three of us, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, we'll call Yitzchak Ke'ata Avinu because you are our father. That's why Yitzchak is Lashon Asid. Why Yitzchak? What's special about Yitzchak that he will associate with the future? So Chassidus explains it in different ways, and here's one of the ways. The Yitzchak begematria ches pamim Havaya. Havaya is 26. 8 times 26 is what? Is 48. 8. 248. Is that right? Well, Kapanim, Yitzchak is 100, 200, or 208, maybe. Yitzchak is 10 and Yud and Tzaddik is 100. Ches is 108 with a kuf, 208. So 26 times 8 is 208.
No, it's not to 12. Yitzchak.
Yud Tzaddik is 100. Ches is 108. Makes 108. And 100 is 208.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. 26 times.
Yeah,
8.
26 times 8 is
208. Okay, good. I trust that I do Rasha, but it's good to know the number, 208. So Yitzchak is gematria 8 times Havaya. The Havaya Ches, who Hashem Havaya de Le'ela. And what are these 8 levels of Havaya? So he doesn't go into the details. He just says the 8th one is the higher Havaya. Why is it the 8th? So he says in the parentheses, so we know in the numbers, the Rashba writes, the Shalosh Tshuvas HaRashba, the Chassidus brings it very much in the Maimorim on Vayhi Bayem HaShmini, Pasha Shmini. Why the 8th day of Miluyim, after 7 days of dedicating the temple, the Mishkan, and the 8th day came the big Iluyim, the big revelations. So he brings, because in the structure, 7 indicates on the cycle of time, 7 days of the week. 8 is Shemeres HaHekev. Hekev is like the circle, and then there's a level, the 8th level is like a transcendent hovering level that protects the 7. Chanukah is connected to that level. Bris Milah is connected to that level. It usually refers to a level of Makiv that's higher. Lamnatzeich al Hashminis in the Likutei Torah and Sazria discusses this. So 8 is always a sign of a higher level that protects the 7, so to speak. When I say protects, meaning it preserves it. It's a power, it's a transcendent power. Okay. So basically, so the 8th level, listen, I'm teaching right now. We'll stop and pause soon for questions and comments. Let's just keep to what we said we'll do. So it goes like this. So the eighth level is the eighth. In other words, Yitzchak is 8 times Havaya. The eighth Havaya is Havaya de Le'ela. So there you have it. So that's why Yitzchak la'asid lavi, that level will be revealed. Sometimes it explains because Yitzchak is Gvura. So Gvura today is more sublimated and secondary to Chesed. But la'asid lavi, just like we learned before, that the Makabel and the Levana and Malchus will elevate. Same thing it says about Gvuras. We'll learn it later in Ayin Beis, that the Gvura will reveal Gvura Tzimtzum. Gvura is concealment. It's discipline. It's restraint. That will reveal the power of the divine in Gvura. So he doesn't say all this, but it's hinted to here. So the number 8, Havaya de Le'ela, is connected to Yitzchak, and that's why we'll say Ki'ata Avinu, because Yitzchak's power will then be revealed more than ever. And he says, V'zehu, the kinner shel Beis HaMikdash, the harp, or the lyre, the kinner in the Beis HaMikdash, Hoya shel Zayin Nimin, well, had 7 strings. It was what do they call a harp? A small harp. It's called a lyre, something like that. Lyre, Lyre.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so in the Beis HaMikdash there was one with 7 strings, but Shal Yemesa Mashiach, the Rosh Tevis is written a little different than usual. So below they say Yemesa Mashiach. The kinner in Yemesa Mashiach will be Ches Nimin. We'll have 8 strings. Kinner hu chavav ner. The word kinner is made up of 2 words. 26 flame, kinner. So when you spell kinner, you're without the yud. So you have chavav and ner. It's made up of 2 words. So chavav gematria begematria havaya. So kinner itself has in it like the light of Havaya, you can say, Ner Havaya, because Havaya is Gematria 26. So as such, V'shal Beis HaMikdash shel Zayin Nimin, Zayin Pamim Havaya. So Kinner, since it's Havaya, the Ner Havaya. So the Beis HaMikdash, meaning the first temple and the second temple, it had 7 times Havaya, 7 strings represented 7 times Havaya. Who Havaya to say the Shtalshlus? That's Havaya, the name of Havaya, as it manifests in the cosmic order, in the structure of the cosmic order. And he adds that Yaakov is also begematria Zayin Pam Havaya. Interesting. So Yitzchak is 8 times Havaya. Yaakov is 7 times Havaya, which is 10, 70, 80, 182. Yeah. Yeah, of course, 182. So plus 26. So Yaakov is gematria Zayin Pam Havaya. It doesn't explain the details, but clearly it's a contrast to Yitzchak, who's 8 times. Shal Yemesa Mashiach shal Ches Nimin. Who gili Shem Havaya de Le'ela. It'll be 1 more string, because the 8th, as we said, goes on Havaya de Le'ela. So Kinner also hints to the Kinner of Yemesa Mashiach, meaning in the future we will have the revelation of Havaya de Le'ela, Havaya Yechatu Merivav, which is primarily going to be L'Asad Love in the future. And then we will have the true inyan, the true fulfillment of God, Havaya, Yechatu, shattering of his enemies, his foes. Okay. So this is somewhat technical, but if you think about it, it really also has a lot of content here. Because what he's doing is showing how Havaya de Le'ela, everywhere you look, makes an appearance. It's full appearance. So number 1, Yitzchak. Just to sum up what we learned, Yitzchak as in 8 times Havaya, the 8th level, which is the higher Havaya. The Kinner, that Yemesa Mashiach will have 8 strings. So the 8th string also being Havaya de Le'ela, and that connects to the fact that that's why L'Asad Lave, when that's revealed, you'll have the true shattering of the Evav, Merivav, enemies. Now he's going to connect it to Rosh Hashanah. Because remember, this Haftarah of Chana, this from Shmuel, Tfilas Chana, that she said, praying for the child that she would give birth, Shmuel, Hanovi. So this pasuk is from this. The Rebbe Rashab is now in the parentheses going to connect it to Rosh Hashanah. Why we say it Rosh Hashanah with a connection to this verse. Before I go there, does anybody have any questions? I mean, there's nothing I really discussed here that's Havana, like understanding. There's more the connections, but in case somebody wants some clarity, I'll stop for a moment before I read the parentheses. Anything? Okay. Good. So he says now the parentheses, V'chein hu b'chol Rosh Hashanah. So even though in the future is when the primary revelation of Havaya D'Leil will take place, but like very often, Chassidus will bring that we have a me'ain, a taste of it, some experience of it. He says the same is also every Rosh Hashanah. T'ksiv vayhi hayem v'yavoyu l'yisyatzav al Havaya. So he says, he brings the pasuk vayhi hayem. Hayem very often refers to Rosh Hashanah, the day.
What? In Iyov, the Satan came to talk against Iyov.
Yeah, it came to Mekatrig. It's like what happens Rosh Hashanah. Yom Hadin, that the Satan above comes to be Mekatrig, comes to complain and bring his grievances. So he says, Ayem here Yaveyu, Lisyatsev al Havaya. Interesting expression. Doesn't say Lisyatsev Lifnei Havaya, al Havaya. V'nidochim aidagilim almayla, and God refuses, pushes it away through the gili from above, which seems like he's saying that al Havaya eliminates the complaint. So he says, why? Because liyes the Rosh Hashanah who gam ken gili shem Havaya D'Leil. Being that on Rosh Hashanah is also the revelation of the higher level of Havaya. What is that referring to? Since you're talking about, you need Havaya D'Leil, if you remember, when he spoke about Tshuva as opposed to mitzvahs, in the end of the first volume, in the second volume, end of last volume, he said Havaya D'Leil is when you cry from the innermost cries. I'll just refer you to the page, because we already learned this idea on page, where was it? It's in Ma'amakim, page 1202. So he said the following: there's Tshuva Tata, that's the remorse and the regret and so on, and Kabbalah. So then he comes to Tshuva Ilah. He says Tshuva Ilah is that Saikim Kadlibi, cry from the depths of the heart to connect to God, Ma'amakim, and that reaches in Pnimius Ein Sof, Megala Amukas Mina Cheshach, Shemash B'chin Shem Havaya D'Leil. The B'shosha Eden Sof Shalif Net Tzimtzum Shmei Agol the Era Bligvul, and that is the power to fill all the injuries or wounds, and Misnapa Mokar Achel, and to heal from the root of the illness. That comes from Matzah. This is all page 1202. So he already introduced Havaya D'Leil has the power to transform. Havaya D'Leil is invoked in order to clean up house. It's like Tshuva Tata. You're getting rid of all the negative things. It's like the Havaya within existence. But if you want to reach something that completely heals and transforms and forgives, it says Slichas Avenis, the forgiving of all the sins on Rosh Hashanah and the 10 days of Tshuva. That's Havaya D'Leil. The Imcha Haslicha. Because only you, have the real power to forgive. So the Imcha tells you something unique that only God has, that this is the level of Havaya that's higher than Ishtalshlus. Zehu Tiku B'Ched Shefer, and this is the meaning, Tiku B'Ched Shefer, Gili Chodesh. The word B'Chedesh means that you shall blow the Shefer, you shall blast the sound the Shefer, B'Chedesh in the month. So different ways. Chedesh also comes from the word chidush. This is a gili chodesh l'mayla ma'ed say this ishtalshlus. This draws down a new revelation, a new oir that's higher than the level of oir in the regular order of seder ishtalshlus. Bekesel yem chagenu, liyem chagenu. So the pasuk says, "Tika b'chedesh shofar bekesel yem chagenu shenimshach mizgala b'schach hasukah." So one of the interpretations of the pasuk goes like this: Tiku b'ched shefer, you shall sound the shefer in the month, meaning when the month is born, which is Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the month. B'kesel liyem chagenu. And that's what is concealed. Rosh Hashanah will be revealed. The Yom Chagenu goes on Chag HaSukkos. So Shanim Shechem is Gala b'Schach HaSukkah. This is revealed in the Schach, in the covering of the Sukkah. Shubchinas Makif. That's a level of Makif as well. Valkein Gam Oz Nedochim Kol HaMekatrigim. And that's why then too on Sukkot, which is essentially the revelation of what happens on Rosh Hashanah, will also push aside and eliminate all the complainers, which is referring to all the negative forces, the merivav, basically, the enemies and the foes. So the Rebbe Rashab in this parentheses very briefly explained why we say Hashem Havaya Yechatu Merivav, because Rosh Hashanah is the level of Havaya de Le'elo that does exactly that. It shatters the enemies, the complainers, all the negative forces that come and say, hey, the Jews were sinful. It eliminates them. And that continues, Tikka B'Chedei Shefer, that's the Tikka B'Chedei Shefer, and continues in the Schach of the Sukkah, which is also a Makif, which also eliminates the negative forces. So that's briefly the connection to Rosh Hashanah. Now, why the Rebbe Rashab felt he wants to add that here? Remember, this is not an individual mimer. You could argue, remember, the last mimer in volume 2 was Parsha Vayera. So it was just a few weeks after Tishrei. So it doesn't make sense that he was writing this, that maybe in the future he would say it the next Rosh Hashanah. So not sure why it's connected. It could be he's connecting it because they're still coming from Rosh Hashanah. It could be that when he wrote it, maybe it was around Rosh Hashanah time, which we know that the writing was preceding the delivery. It's all speculation. I'm just thinking out loud why the Rebbe Rashab felt the need to connect it to Rosh Hashanah, even though obviously the verses said Rosh Hashanah, but it could be that was the Tkufa, maybe, not sure. And maybe we'll never know. It's fine too, because regardless, the piece makes sense. It's connected to the subject matter, but it's a parenthesis. Okay? Now he continues where we left off, which is what? So now we have two Havayas. The Havaya that relates to structure and existence, and that which will be revealed L'asad Lavi, and we have a taste of it in Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot, and that's the Havaya that eliminates negative forces. I don't want to jump and say, how is that connected to what we learned Ayin, even though you could probably already guess and speculate, but I'll wait till the Rebbe Rashab connects it.
How is it that the Shem Havaya La'ela is pushing away the prosecutors, the complainers, the Mekatrigim? What's the mechanism there?
You can only change a system from outside the system. So the divine revelations that relate to structure of existence can deal with things that are commensurate to them. And you need a force, like he said before, when he said that Havaya Ish Milchama is already Havaya how he engages in war. That's not the same level that eliminates the enemy. Whereas Havaya Leil is transcendent, is above, so it has the ability to, like Tshuva has to come from a power that's greater than the regular, usual, routine Avedus Hashem, because the routine has been somewhat compromised. So now you need, like you spoke in the previous volume, that refuah, healing, he said, comes from something sharp and strong. You need something stronger. You can't just rely on regular food. If somebody's not well, they need stronger medications, stronger interventions to heal. That idea. Okay. Now, good. V'zehu, continuing the last lines on page 1210. V'zehu sha'aposel medaber hakol loshen osid. Yechatu. And that's what explains why the pasuk speaks in the future. It's all loshen osid. It's not past and not present. Yechatu, you will. God will shatter. Why? Why is it not talking that he's shattering? Because the main shlemus of this, the complete shattering, will be in the future. Vayiten, vayorum. So it says, when he says in the other part, vayiten is, vayiten, doesn't say vanosa. And it says vayorum, he will. He will give fortitude, strength, lamalke, vayorum, and he will lift and raise the keren, the horn of Mashiach. It's all hakol loshen osid. It's all in the future. It's all the language for the future. Mipnei. Why? Because shamitis dover zeh yeh losid. because the true expression of this, the true revelation of this, will be in the future. This doesn't mean that you don't have some of it now. We said Rosh Hashanah, for example, we have an element of it. And there's an element of it by David HaMelech, which Chana prayed for. But nevertheless, the full Shlem, like it says, Shlem mitis davar zeh. And earlier he said, if you look earlier, he said the word is, he said the words, so I'm going to find exactly. Ikir in Yezayil Asid will be in the future. The Zehu, page 1211. The Zehu, Kameshah Kosagabe Mulchamas Amalek, and this is like it says by the war that Teda tells us about the fighting the war against Amalek. Moche Emcha, you say Moche Emcha. Moche means erase, and Emcha, I will erase. The Pirish Emcha ba'atzmi dafke. So what's this? What's the addition of I dafke will do it? You could say Moche Zecher Amalek. Erase the memory, erase Amalek. What's the Emcha? It says Emcha ba'atzmi. I'm atzmi dafke. I will do it. The Mashakos of Timche Zecher Amalek. When it says Timche Zecher Amalek, not Emcha. Husha Adam Yimche Ba'avedose. That's what the human being does, erases it through his work, through his effort. And there it says Metachas HaShamayim. Erase Amalek from under the heavens. Because that is in our capacity. We have the ability as much as possible to erase Amalek as he's under the heavens. That level. The Klippa as is below. Whereas Emcha is referring to a higher level of elimination, similar to the elimination of Havaya, Yechat Merivov, that comes from a higher level. He doesn't explicitly say it, but let's see in a second. Maybe he will spell it out. So two things he's focusing on. Emcha be'atzmi, that I will do it, God will do it. And now he's adding, V'emer mochi emcha loshen osid. There's also the element that Emcha will also be in the future. So in addition to the fact that only God does it, that will be dafka, that primarily will be dafka in the future. So in other words, today we're able to do it as much as we can. The clip of Amalek as he is relates to existence, but completely eliminating even not Shamayim, but higher, that's in the future. Okay, so he's bringing that as basically both elements. You have Havaya Le'ela, Emchaz. He doesn't say it's Havaya Le'ela, but it says clearly Atzmi higher than Havaya of the person. And two, that will be in the future. Ukamoy came, similar to this. Mashakosiv Yechatu Merivov, but it says will eliminate or shatter his Merivov, his enemies, his foes. Ikara Inyan Yela Osidafka. The primary union of this, the primary realization of this will be dafke la'asid, specifically in the future. However, l'cheda ain't a mover. But seemingly it's not understood. Shari la'asid oz epich el, it says in the pasuk, in Sfanya, that the Eibishter will epich al amim ksofa bruda, the full verse. The Rambam brings it at the end of chapter 11, in Hilchas Malachim, the end of the Rambam, it says that in the future, then I will transform. Yechatu Merivov is you'll shatter, you'll destroy them. Epech is transformation. Yechatu Merivov is batlu. That means, that refers to that they will be eliminated. They will be annihilated, nullified. Aval oz epech hushara yehapech l'tev. Epech means transformation. It doesn't say, if he would say, Oz Yuvatlu as El Amim, or Oz, whatever the expression. He says Epech. That's a haficha. That's transformation to the good. The Zeu al-derech, when you say your hafich, it's like it says in the pasuk, Le'ova Hashem l'shmaya ve'yapech Hashem l'kech l'cha. The God will not, it's talking about the curses. He says that he will not
want to listen, and
he will not allow himself to listen. And on the contrary, to the curses, Vayapech, he will transform them for bracha. In the parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab qualifies and says, okay, so he's saying like this. The pasuk v'layova has two phrases. One is God will not allow himself to listen to the curses. That's more negating them. Then the second half of the pasuk is transforming them. So the question, of course, here is, Havaya yechatu is only eliminating, not transforming. So the pasuk, however, he's saying v'layova, he says, is not as strong as yechatu. Layova means God refuses to listen. Yechatu, which means to shatter or destroy, is stronger than v'layova. So the Rebbe Rashab is just qualifying the first half of the statement. So now we have two levels. So he's putting in a phrase, he phrased it like a question. So what do we see from this? So we know from this that which is transformed to good, that's a higher level than the level that destroys. So why is he saying yechatu the koy gamkin al osid? I'll explain what that means in a second. Let me just explain. So why do you say yechatu, which refers also to the future? So here's what he's saying basically. If Yechata Merivav was talking about today in Zman HaGolus, or even the time of David, okay, you could say because today we don't have the Gilu of Havaya Le'ela, so we don't have transformation, we only have elimination. But you're saying here, made a whole case that Havaya Yechatu, Lashon Asid, is referring to Asid Lavi. When you have Havaya Le'ela, we know the Asid Lavi, the main Chiddush will be transformation more than elimination. So why are we talking about elimination, Asid Lavi? Elimination could also happen, but the main thing would be transformation. That's briefly what he's asking. So in other words, there are two levels. The truth is, if you think about it now, remember, Havaya Ish Milchama, God is a warrior, it means he's engaging in the battle. Then you have Havaya, that's Havaya de Latata, Havaya de Le'ela that eliminates and shatters Yechata Midivav, is his foes and enemies. And then we're talking now a level of transformation, as epech, transformation. So he thought, and obviously we can speculate answers to this question, but there's a question now on the table, and that's the question is, since it's going on la'asid, why does he only say yechatu? It's much more than yechatu, basically. It's transformation. So clearly there's something important in both levels, both in elimination and in transformation. So that's the question on the table, and that ends the paragraph here on top of page 1211. So I'll stop again for questions, and if not, then they'll continue. We have time, we're going to continue learning. Anything anyone wants to ask? Clarity? Well, it's pretty straightforward, actually. Okay. So let's continue. Now, just for the record, this is not going to be answered for a while. If I'm correct, as I said in the last class, maybe earlier he speaks about it. I think this is not addressed until Aleph Shin, what did I say? Aleph Shin.
1287.
1287, I said. Is that what I said?
If it had to do with understanding who are the enemies and why is he killing those enemies, which I think it's related to, then you said 1287.
Now I'm looking now for the answer to the question. Let me see if he answers it there. Probably 1287 and on, I see goes back to it. I didn't find earlier. There may be earlier as well, but right now, okay, we'll get there when we get there. So there's a question now hanging. And that's fine because we're also in the middle of a long parenthesis of over 500 pages. That's also not finished yet. So there's a lot of things that need to be tied up. So what we've established here is that Rebbe Rashab has now entered a new phase in Ayin Beis. After explaining what Einoid is in a few pages, the basic points, he now has entered into this world of the Merivov, and now is going to become another new discussion. Now, for those that have never learned Chassidus in this style, it can throw you because it's very different than usual. You know, for example, when you learn Tanya, Alter Rebbe asks a bunch of questions in chapter 1. He doesn't begin to answer the questions until 10, 11, 12, 13 chapters later. So when you learn it the first time, it's not usually how you learn things. There's a question. Yes, there's an introduction and some explanation, and then you get back to the question. But in Chassidus, you'll find it's not the case. In Chassidus, a mimer begins with questions usually in the beginning, and at the end ends answering them. But a regular mimer is 10 pages, 15 pages, 7 pages, 8 pages. In Ayin Beis, there are questions that sometimes take hundreds of pages till they're answered. Now, the reason for that is, like I explained the other day, Chassidus, you have a language, when there's a question asked, then it says, Ach ha'inyan hu. It's an interesting way of putting it. Usually you say, Tzarich lahavin, we have to understand, v'yesh leimer, and here's the answer, question, answer. But Chassidus expression of the answer is, Ach ha'inyan hu. However, the inyan in this is, why doesn't it just say, Ach yesh leimer? However, here's the answer. Because Chassidus' approach in general, like the Alter Rebbe, derech harucha ktsara, it takes the long, short approach. Instead of a question, answer, question, answer, Chassidus comes and gives a whole new perspective on a subject. The inyan, acha inyan. And then, memela, automatically you'll have answer to the initial question and other questions as well. Now, many of us, when we study, when we went to school, that is a harder way of learning than the other way. The other way, you ask a question, you have an answer. But if you think about it, it's a arucha ktsara. Because if someone gives you a new perspective on an entire subject, you don't just come away with an answer to your question. You come away with a whole different way of looking at it. And that's a very common. This is Chassidus style. And you see right here playing itself out. Started Ayin, which is also part of a longer subject matter. Ubir Ayin with Havaya yechatu merivav. And now he says, Lahavin calls that Tzarech lahavin a hefresh ben Gan Eden le'elam Haboh. Completely, seemingly unrelated. And here it's even stronger. Before he said, Ubir Ayin, to explain the Ayin. Now he says, Lahavin calls that. To understand all of this, so he's going to now to a much broader subject, but when you come away with it, you come away with like a bird's eye view of the whole picture. And once you have the whole picture, it's a very different way of looking at the details, including the questions you have. I wanted to point it out. I've mentioned it a number of times, but it's sometimes good to see it in play, see it in action, because it really gives you a way of how the Rebbe Rashab is, the methodology of Chassidus, the methodology of the Rebbe Rashab, especially in Ayin Beis, where he does it in full glory. So simply have to adjust yourself to this approach and recognize there are going to be questions asked. Sometimes you won't get to it for hundreds of pages, or at least 100 pages, 50 pages, whatever it may be. And meanwhile, he's going to introduce all kinds of other topics. But then when you see it all come together, you say, wow, I got myself a real picture. And in the long term, this is definitely will transform how you think. A question, like if you answer the question of right here, you'd get your answer. It'd be an adequate answer, but it wouldn't reflect, it wouldn't reveal the whole idea and the concept. What is a war, and what is an enemy, and what levels that God gives us. In other words, the Chassidus takes this pasuk, which can be just very narrowly understood, into a broad context of all battles that we will ever fight, and actually the very battle of existence itself. That's really what he's going to come away with. So when you think of it that way, then it calms us down a bit, that we don't be so impatient that he didn't answer the question yet. Don't worry about that. What's more important here is getting the picture. Then the questions will be answered in the right time. So I wanted to just clarify that for, especially if you have never been exposed to this way of learning. Okay.
Rabbi, one quick question on the lashon he uses, because it picks it up later in terms of the answer. Who are the enemies and how does he push them away? The word hisyatzev, how are you translating it? And like, can you dissect it? Because the modern Hebrew says to stabilize. It doesn't make any sense in this context. I don't understand
how.
how.
As Rav Shlomo said, it's referring to the Satan, the prosecuting angel or angels that rise up above. They stand up. It's like when the prosecuting, when the DA, the prosecutor stands up before the court and presents a case against what is it called? The
defendant. He makes his case. That's Hisatzev. I'm telling you where I'm coming from. This is the basis.
Hisatzev not necessarily makes a case. Hisatzev literally means he stands up. But we know that the prosecutor stands up from his seat. He's going to make a case. So it has all that in it. Since it's not really relevant here to the Ayin Beis, if you really want to understand it, I would go to the Pasuk in Iyuv, see how the commentaries, Rashi and the Mitzudas,
By the way, in the beginning.
right? See how they translate it. If you
Okay.
want to go deeper, you go to the Radak and the books that talk digduk on that word. But this, and then you want Chassidus, you have to look at the Rosh Hashanah Mamorim. They talk about this,
Okay.
about this.
No, just you referred me to 1287 to get a sneak peek on the answer, and he uses this word a lot by there, so it's hard to understand the answer
Well,
without
since we're not
understanding
in
this word.
Well, this is exactly what I want to avoid. I am not going to learn 1287 now. When we'll get there, we'll learn it and we'll understand it. Right now, we're learning here. So,
Okay. I wasn't pushing you there. I wanted to understand one word. That's it.
okay, so that's the way I would approach it. Okay. Well, Lahavin calls that Tzarech Lahavin, a Hefresh ben Gan Eden Le'elam Haboh, which seemingly is not directly related, but we'll see how it gets related. To understand all this, we have to understand the difference. And you see the difference. Lahavin calls that to Bira Inyan. These all are very nuanced and very specific, because now he's going to talk about the whole subject matter. So much broader. So we have to understand what is the difference in Gan Eden and Elam Haboh. So in Torah, just in Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh primarily, you have sometimes a reference to Gan Eden, which most people understand. Of course, the original Gan Eden was when Adam and Eve were placed there. But Gan Eden today, we talk about Gan Eden where the neshamas go to and where they spend their time learning Torah and so on. It's a ruchnizdika world, a spiritual world that comes as a reward and follows this world. But we also have an expression, Elam Haboh, the world to come. So there are actually two opinions. Some people say Elam Haboh is Gan Eden. Some people say Elam Haboh is Tchias HaMesim, the future. Gan Eden exists now. But then there's the future when Mashiach comes, especially in Mashiach's coming good self, the world to come, meaning not the world that follows the world now, which means, as the Rambam says, doesn't follow in time. It means it's a result of our work in this world, go to the next world. But sometimes Elam Haboh refers to Lasid Love, Mashiach's coming, and that guf for the second period, Tchias HaMesim. So I'm not trying to disturb the flow of the Rebbe Rashab. I just wanted to make it clear that Gan Eden and Elam Haboh are not necessarily always used as synonymous. So that's what he's asking. What's the difference? Well, we need to understand what is the difference. And look and delve into what it said earlier, the Maimer Vayeshiv Yaakov. That he refers below. I see in the volume 2, page 781. Because there it was discussed pretty much also, pretty depth. Tavshin Pei Aleph. Let me just refresh myself by looking there. Yeah, right before the Chanukah Maimer. Yeah, I thought so. Okay. Tavshin Pei Aleph is Vayeshev, right? Vayeshev. What does he say here? Yeah. He was actually speaking there about Aramim Chalakaya Melch Mamayla Lamata Mamata Lamayla. But Gan Eden and Elam Haboh. Okay, with Nahar Dinar and all kinds of levels there. 2 levels of the river Dinar, the fiery fire, the river. Those of you want to look there, you can remember. But I'm not going to refer to that right now because we'll learn it here. And I think some of the things that say there are going to help us understand what it says here. But we'll draw on that when needed. So he says like this. Okay, so right now, what's the operative new topic is Gan Eden and Elam Haboh. What's the difference? Dini Yadua, just to show that it is connected. Remember, Elam Haboh being the future, then he's talking about Lasid Love now. So Lasid Love is Hashem Havaya Chatem Merivov, or Oz Epech, transformation, or annihilation, transformation, is talking about the future. So you can see Gan Eden and Elam Haboh is not completely left field. It is connected, but the exact connection we shall learn. Because obviously they're both divine revelation. Question is, what's the difference between Gan Eden and Elam Haboh? Yedua, because now it's known, that with Gan Eden Nimshach, let me add one more thing I'd like to say. When we did Chazal, when I would remember the Rebbe's Farbrengens, including my Morim, so very often this was the style. The Rebbe would ask a question, and then he would say, to understand this, we need to preface other matters. Sometimes the way the mind works, even though it shouldn't have been doing, I shouldn't have been processing, but sometimes I would speculate very quickly and then shut it off very quick. what could be the connection. Like in this case, you could speculate that Gan Eden maybe is Havaya de Latato and Olam Haba is Havaya de Le'ela. But I would immediately stop myself from doing that, because if I did that, I wouldn't hear what the Rebbe is going to say or hear what I'm going to say. So right here too, when learning this properly, it was like deja vu for me, because I'm learning this. I'm right away thinking, what's the connection? But that's when you process, and I don't process. I absorb. So when I'm absorbing right now, I'm not allowing myself even to go there. The reason being, what would be the benefit? The Rebbe Rashab is going to go there when he wants to, and then I'll get it in his words instead of my own. So instead of speculating, now if the mimer ended here for whatever reason, and he didn't end up writing anything further, then there was no choice but to speculate. So I just wanted to point that out in the process of learning. So right now he's going to talk about these two levels. He's going to say, Dehini Yadua, because now it's known, the Gan Eden nimshach teisvus tomid aydei ma'aseh mitzvos. In Gan Eden, in this level called Garden of Eden, Gan Eden, paradise, is on an ongoing basis, additional energies, divine energies, are being generated there through the ma'aseh mitzvos, through the actionable mitzvahs, through the action of mitzvahs, be'elam haza, in this world. So when you put on film, you eat kosher, you light a candle, you give tzedakah, whatever it may be, it's not just that you're doing something in this world where you're helping someone, that you're even drawing elikus and godliness into this world, but you're also, it's generating energy that builds up energies in Gan Eden. So Gan Eden essentially is a spiritual station, a spiritual place, space, spiritual. It's not somewhere in the sky. It's not behind any planet or star. It's a spiritual entity that reflects many different things. But what he's saying right now is that the Oyer of Gan Eden, Tosfos said, is constantly being nimshach through our ma'aseh mitzvahs. Be'elam hazeh dafke. In other words, not anywhere else. Dafke in Olam hazeh. Kashen. Let me read again. I think the dafka goes on Olam hazeh, not on the next words. Okay, so now he's adding something. Not just the action of the mitzvahs, when they're done with intention and with desire of the heart. Rusa deliba is an expression from Zohar that refers to many different things, but briefly, it means you're not just doing it mechanically. That's kavanah, you have intention. But also there's a inner desire from your heart that's involved, a certain passion, a certain commitment. So it's more than just doing the action. So I'm reading it again, whether the dafka goes, you're doing yeah, it goes on Olam hazeh. Like it says, right in the beginning of Genesis and Bereshis, when Adam is placed in Gan Eden, and remember Gan Eden that we're talking about now associates with the Gan Eden that Adam was placed in. We'll talk about that later when we get into the details. So it says, what does it say? That he placed Vayinechehu, the Gan Eden, he placed the Adam that he created. The Eibishter took Vayikach Offer min Adam, Hashem Elokim Offer min Adam, he took earth, Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, he blew into its nostrils the breath of life, the breath of God, divine breath, and he placed this living human being now in Gan Eden with a purpose, la'avda u'lashamra, to serve and to protect. U'amr Azal, what's the difference between la'avda and l'shamra? La'avda ramach mitzvah sesa, to serve means through the 248 positive mitzvahs, u'lashamra, which means to protect, which means to avoid or to protect from something negative. The Shassal said the 365 negative mitzvahs, thou shalt not. So thou shalt not steal is from the 365. Honor your parents is from the positive. Just to use it, two examples from the 10 Commandments. Okay. Shaidei zeh, by Adam doing that, both serve and protect the positive mitzvahs and avoiding the negative, through this nimshach teisvus eidos began Eden. So though it doesn't say it explicitly in the pasuk, but if you think about it, Adam was there to do what? To serve and protect the garden. Now this doesn't mean just technically that he's like the gardener who's making sure that there are no that the weeds are weeded and the seeds are planted and he waters the garden and etc., like he says, Eid Yalam in Oretz, that through his work, he draws down the rains. It means also Beruchnius. He's sustaining, and addition is basically more than sustaining. He's enriching and drawing Teisvasedis in Gan Eden. That's what Adam's role. So Gan Eden was created by God with all the trees and all the plants and everything Gan Eden had. Adam was placed there to serve and protect, to make the garden grow. And that's Beruchnius, what he's saying, Teisvasedis in Gan Eden. So just as Adam did it in the original Gan Eden, we do it today through our Maisa mitzvahs, through our actions, through our mitzvahs, also positive and negative, kavana, with intention, and rusa deliberate, the desire of the heart. Even though in Gan Eden was radiating a Gilead even before Adam came. Like it says that God planted a garden in Eden. Like it says, Nor Yotzim Eden, and he planted a garden there. Shenemer Shem Mole. It doesn't just say Havaya, it says Havaya Lekim. So even if it said one, you also have something there. But he says now Shem Mole, the Hainu, Shebegan Eden Me'er Elyon Harbi Yeshem in Er Shebe Elamus. God created the entire world. But we know the Garden of Eden was a special place. That's where it says Hashem Elokim planted a garden there, filled with all kinds of trees. He didn't do that in the other parts of the world, even though the other parts of the world also have vegetation. But clearly the Torah is saying Hashem Elokim Be'ita was a particular revelation that was higher on its own. He means Elamus here because we took both physically, the Garden of Eden was more special than the rest of the world, but here he's also talking spiritually. The Gan Eden is unique within the worlds themselves. Not the worlds themselves are not all Gan Eden. Gan Eden is a special revelatory level in all the worlds, as we see from the verse here, Vayita Havaya Lekim Gan Ben Eden. Uba Elamus ha'eru behelam. In the Elamus, in addition to being higher, he says in the Elamus, in the worlds, the divine energy is concealed. And in Gan Eden, the divine energy is revealed. So based on this, we have to say that even though that's the case, the Hagam, nevertheless, when Adam comes, when the human being comes, it becomes even greater. That's what he continues. Mekol mokim, sheyeh teisvaser began Eden, or teisvaser rather. In order for there to be teisvaser, an additional element of revelation, began Eden, al zehu aveda, and that's the purpose of the aveda. So Adam comes la'avda l'shamra to work and protect, which is to increase. He didn't create the beauty of Gan Eden, its initial state of revelation, but he increases and adds to it. That's why he's using the word teisvaser. The Gan Eden is there, but we're increasing to it. Like it is physically. Like it's physically, when you work a garden, you're gardening, what does it do? Is in order for the tzmicha, the growth, should be b'tev yeser, should be perfected, should be better, should be improved. In other words, you can have a garden and no one takes care of it. So besides the fact that it's going to get weeded and all other problems that can happen, but also will it maximize its potential? No. The gardener, the person who tends to the garden, will cause it to the tzmicha b'tev yeser, the growth should be improved on many levels. It's not going into details. It could be also to make sure everything is growing properly, but also that the growth will be to the maximum. Or b'tev yeser means much improved, much better. And what does the Aveda consist of? Okay, now he does explain. I didn't realize he was going to explain. It says, "Va'avedahu l'sakel havonim u'lahashkis sagan." Basically, two things, which corresponds to la'avda l'shamra. The sakel havonim means to remove the stones stones and that may grow and that get in the way, don't allow things to grow properly, so you have to remove them. Not sure why he's saying only avonim, not like eretz, weeding the weeds. It's eretz aritzim. Keres aritzim is usually the expression, like psuka de zimra, lezamer aritzim. Okay, fine. But that's what he says, l'sakal avonim, u'lahashkes asagan, and to water and irrigate the garden. So it's not just enough to remove any impediments, it's also you need to water and irrigate the garden. Kamoy kain, so just as it is begashmi, is kamoy kain who shall yedei aved b'mitzvos leisa, b'mitzvos leisa u'mitzvos, the same through the work. In mitzvos leisa say begins now because that's the first, the sakal avonim, to removing the stones. U'mitzvos the positive. What is that? Nimshach teisvos is beganei. So that's what the Avodah does. It tends to the garden and makes things grow better, specifically to remove the negatives and bring in and irrigate the positive. So by doing that, just like the gardener who tends to the garden causes the garden to flourish, so too here, or causes it to have more abundance, so too here, nimshach teisvus, additional oir, of course here it means divine energy, is drawn into the Garden of Eden, Garden of Gan Eden. The Ayin Mashin is bar leal dibra maskal Pinchas. Again, in volume 2, it says page 1064. I'm just looking just to refresh my memory. Allah Samar Dalad, what mimer was that? Oh, Shabbos. It was about Shabbos Birurim. Yeah. Yeah, there, by the way, he does say more detail is that of the Shamra is first thing is the Tias Eitzim Vashkas Hagan, planting trees and irrigating the garden, and the second Basaras HaKeitzim, to remove the weeds or remove the thorns, Va'avonim and the stones, V'chol Sigim Upselis, and all the waste and leftovers or whatever. So he speaks there more detail what we learned here. It's the bottom of page 1064 and the top of 1065. Yeah. Okay, good. Anybody want to ask anything before I read on?
I have a question. Why, if he's talking about Adam Arishon, which is an archetype of human being, or first human being, does it talk about the the mitzvahs? Because that whole Torah applies to the Yidden, not to all of humanity. So what's the shaykhus between Adam Arishon and the 248 and 365? How do you relate that?
So first of all, it's not a question on Ayin Beis. There's plenty of Maimorei Chazal that talk about that Adam kept the mitzvahs. Love the L'shamar is a Maimor Chazal from Medrash. So it's not at all question of the Rebbe Rashab. It's just a general question on the whole topic of before Matan Torah, what was going on. So first of all, before Matan Torah, they kept the Adam kept all the mitzvahs, as did Avraham Avinu and the Ovis, even though they were not yet in the category of Jewish, because the concept of Jew and non-Jew really began by Matan Torah. That's the brief answer.
Okay, thank you.
And the more details, I'd suggest either talk to some of the other guys. There's a whole discussions on this matter of what kind of Torah mitzvahs was before and what came later, and so on and so forth. But for practical purposes, Adam represents, yes, the quintessential human being in Gan Eden, which represents the work of each of us. And the Arizal actually writes that had there not been Eitz Hadas, Chet Eitz Hadas, I just explained it this Saturday night on Tanya, actually last night, right? Yeah. In the Tanya, where the beginning of chapter 2, he brings this Vayipach Ba'apov about calls it the second soul of the Jew. Adam is also the ancestor of all human beings. So according to the Arizal, had there not been the Chet Tzadas, in general, the whole world would be different. There would be no concept of Goyishkeit. There would only be the idea of bringing godliness into the world. But that's a whole other discussion. I don't want to really go there. It'll be very distracting. But I spoke about it last night somewhat.
Thank
Good.
you. I'm still catching up.
Yeah. And this is the difference between the neshamas, the way they are before they descend to this world. They are in Gan Eden. We say the neshamas reside, as I mentioned before, in Gan Eden. So neshama has not yet come down to this world. It's in Gan Eden. What does that say? That's the Garden of Eden as it's on its own, for this person, that is. Because he hasn't yet done any Aved. He hasn't come down to earth to do any Aved. Now, of course, you could ask the question, what about reincarnation? Maybe he's been here before. For practical purpose, let's just think of it like the soul that's in Gan Eden has not yet come down to this world. So then he's in Gan Eden. He's benefiting from it, but he's not doing anything to enrich and the abundance and the tasteless air that he's speaking about, the additional air. By the Aveda, by coming down below, and through the work, nimshach tasteless air. That's when you draw down tasteless air. So the Neshama Gan Eden has a certain measure of divine revelation and delight. And then the Miziv HaShechina benefits from the reflection of the Shechina of godliness. But it's when he comes down and through the work, that's when it draws tasteless air, this additional energy. Nevertheless, we can say, nevertheless, even though Aveda does draw down into Gan Eden more energy, but it's still Ba'esa Mahus. It's still the same personality of Gan Eden. It's not something that's complete paradigm shift. Like we see when a person works a garden, tends to the garden, and makes things grow better than if there was no one there, he's not creating a whole new reality. He's making the garden, he's maximizing it, that it should be at its best. Whereas if there were the stones and the negatives and they weren't irrigating, it wouldn't be. So it's not a muhus acher, it's eise muhus. In the language of Chassidus, everything's the revelation of the divine within existence. The only difference is it on its own, so it has a certain measure of godliness and godly revelation, and through Aveda, you increase. It could even be in quality, not just in quantity, but it's still b'mala kalam. That's the revelation of Gan Eden. Like it says elsewhere. The difference between before Aveda and after Aveda is that the Gili is on a higher level. The revelation is on a higher level. Like I said, it could be quantity, quality is more likely, but it's still within that paradigm, within that structure. Okay. I'm just looking about the parentheses. Yeah, let's learn it. Might as well. So now, the Rebbe Rashab, as he does very often in Ayin Beis, he brings from other places just to round out the subject, cross-reference, and sometimes reconcile different statements. So he says the following: in Biyuri Azeir, Parsha Achrei. Biyuri Azeir, generally, as I think I mentioned, the Alter Rebbe for a number of years on Friday night would say an explanation of the Zohar of that parsha. The Mittler Rebbe would write down these Hanochas. He'd write it down after Shabbos, obviously. And later in the Mittler Rebbe's time, he gathered these Maimorim, instead of putting them out by the dates, he associated them with the Zohar of each of those weeks and published a book called Biyurei HaZohar. So they go from Parsha Bereshis, Noach, Lech Lecha. Same order as the Zohar, the explanation of the Alter Rebbe in Zohar. It was essentially Maimorim on the Zohar. The Tzemach Tzedek has also a Biur Hazer where he takes these Maimorim and he explains them further and adds gloss and adds comments and footnotes and so on. So when we say Biur Hazer, generally plain Biur Hazer is usually referring to the Mittler Rebbe's Biur Hazer, which is Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe that Mittler Rebbe wrote down. But sometimes it refers to both. When you look them up, you usually look both. Whenever you want to look inside, you look at the Mittler Rebbe first, and then you look at the Tzemach Tzedek. Just wanted to tell you about the Sefer called Biur Hazer. Recently, they gave out a new edition of the Mittler Rebbe with a lot of footnotes. It's a more developed, a more advanced edition, meaning more annotated and so on. Same Maimorim, no change, but also the original Biur Hazer was Rashi letters. Now it's bold printed letters. Okay, good. So he says Biur Hazer and Parsha Achrei Al Maimer Hazer Daf Ayin Zayin. On the Maimer, the statement in the Zohar, page 87. Tana is avris hey law. I'd have to look up what it's talking about there, but basically the Zohar says something. He's very brief. Tana is avris hey law. Talking about something about the elevation of the hey law is usually refers to the Yud Kei Vav Kei, the first hey of Yud Kei Vav Kei. Ubagos l'sham mashma, and the agos to there sounds like Tzemach Tzedek's agos that I just mentioned. It appears that Gili de Ganed Mitzaratzme ubchinis Keser Chachma Bina the Malchus. That it appears from there in that the agos, the footnote, the gloss on that Maimer, on the Zohar, talking about hey law, Gan Eden Mitzad Atzma, Gan Eden on its own, without Aveda, is the level of Keser Chachma Bina. The Gimel Rishain is the first three spheres in Malchus. Remember, every sphere has all the other spheres in it. This Chachma has Chachma Sheba Chachma, Bina Sheba Chachma. So every sphere has all the spheres. So Malchus too has the Keser and the Chachma Bina within Malchus. He says that's Gan Eden on its own. But on its own, Gan Eden is receiving the Keser Chacham Bina of Malchus. Gan Eden is receiving its energy from Zah. Remember, we learned like the moon from the sun, Malchus from Shemesh. Not front to face, but back to back. In other words, it's a very diminished flow, relatively speaking. Panim b'panim, if you recall on page 1208, he said was like the full moon. When the moon and the sun are facing each other and they're facing Earth, so we see a full moon, a full face. Then he continues, the Gan Eden that he placed Adam in Gan Eden, that's in order to affect a revelation face to face. So notice the Biur Hazer adds that the difference we're talking about, where the garden on its own is a level of, there's a garden, but it doesn't have the taste, the additional air. What are the exact levels? So based on the Biur Hazer, he says that the garden itself is Keser Chachma Bina of Malchus receiving from Zah, but back to back, meaning a more diminished flow. And Adam is able to draw down face to face a much more expanded flow, basically. Hold on, let me finish the parentheses. 1 second. The Rebbe Rashab now brings another Maimon. In Lekutei Torah, in the Maimon Bamidbar Sinai Be'el Meid, that's the beginning of Bamidbar. In Lekutei Torah, he says, the Gan Eden Mitzaratzme Bria Sheba Bria. Gan Eden on its own is Bria within Bria. Because remember, the worlds again are also encompassing. There's Atzilus within Bria, and there's Bria within Bria. V'yesh leimer shezel b'chinas kachab de Bria. The Rebbe Rashab is now reconciling the two. He's saying, Yeshlem, this is the Keser Chachma Bina of Bria, like he said before, the Keser Chachma Bina of Malchus. The Isa Beis Chaim Shar Kisei HaKoved, the Teferes Netzach Hed Yesei de Malchus Meir B'Kachab de Bria. It's an acronym that the kachab is keser chachma bina. But that's a teferes, netzach hed yesed. The lower spheres in Malchus, they radiate in the chasra chachma bina, the bria. So that's the reconciliation. That bria, the bria, seems to be a lower level than Malchus. But once you know that so basically saying the beauty Azair says that the Gan Eden on its own is Keser Chachma Bina of Malchus back to back. But from the lower levels of Malchus, radiating Keser Chachma Bina of Bria. So that's like Bria of Bria. And that is what happens. That's what it says in Likutei Torah. And the Adam adds a different dimension that's higher than that, which is the Panim B'Panim. That's the parentheses. So it's somewhat Kabbalistically technical, but he basically wants to establish the levels we're talking about and where they exactly say the Ishtalshlus. That's what the parentheses comes to add. Yeah. Chab the Malchus. That's the Yesh Leimer. Chab the Bria. Yeah, Bria Sheva Bria is Chab the Bria, which comes from the lower levels of Malchus. So it has something similar just on the lower level. It's actually two ways to explain Gan Eden on its own. According to Likutei Torah, is Chab of Bria, which comes from the lower levels of Malchus, and Vayinecha Adam, Vayinecha Began Eden would be higher than that, higher than the Keser Chachma Bina of Bria. Be like Atzilus of Bria, probably. Okay. Okay. Does anybody want to ask anything? Okay. I see the next lines. He's actually going to talk about what we spoke about earlier, what kind of mitzvahs Adam was Mekayim. But I think I would stop here because...
What abbreviation of Haboh?
Because he's going to now talk about the type of mitzvahs that Adam, he says, what ruchni is the mitzvahs.
Rabbi Jacobson.
Okay.
I'm going to stop. One second. Hold on.
Haboh.
Well, just 1 second.
Beis Aleph, what's your favorite?
1 second. I'm going to stop now at the end of the parentheses, Chab de Bria. We'll take some questions. Go ahead. What were you asking?
What is Aleph Beis Aleph abbreviation? What is it?
Acher ba'acher.
Okay.
Rabbi Jacobson, I always understood, and maybe it was wrong, that Gan Eden, there's Gan Eden and a Tachton and Gan Eden and Elyon. And that Gan Eden and Elyon was in Bria, and Gan Eden and Tachton was in Yitzira. Now there seems to be at this level of Gan Eden in Atzilus. And that was my first question. How does that relate? Maybe I just have it wrong. And the second thing was, when they put Adam into Gan Eden, was that level of where he goes Panim El Panim only of that highest level of an Atzilus, or also in Bria, or go
Turn right
both?
to Brooklyn Bridge.
So first of all, the word Gan Eden in general, it may speak that way at times, that Gan Eden aliens in Bria and Gan Eden Tachton is in Yitzira. But the truth is, in every world there's a level of Gan Eden. Just like in every world there's a level of Chachma and Malchus and so on. Second point, he didn't say Atzilus is Gan Eden, he said Malchus of Atzilus, which is really the lowest level of Atzilus as they're already preparing to go into Bria. So it could very well be that when he says Gan Eden here, he means either the beginning of Gan Eden or the root of Gan Eden, of Bria, in Gan Eden, in Malchus, what he calls Keser Chachma Bina of Malchus, or even Keser Chachma Bina of Bria, as he said, according to Likutei Torah. So it's not inconsistent in that sense. Finally, or two more points. Right now, he's not going into distinguishing between the higher and lower Gan Eden. He's talking Gan Eden in general. Maybe he'll talk about the two levels at some point, maybe. And finally, I want to say is, when you say the Adam increases, we're talking here clearly on all levels. Because first he started with the human being on earth, on Maisa Mitzvahs below, add energy in Gan Eden, wherever Gan Eden is. And then he's talking about Adam Arishon doing the same. When he came in and made Gan Eden stronger and made it grow. So when he's saying here the Adam, he's talking, I think, on all levels. The most important level here is, of course, our mitzvahs down below on earth that increase energy into the world of Mamala Kalamin, of Gili Elikus, in the worlds, the higher worlds. But I don't think he's going into specifically identifying where. He says, Acher ba'acher, panim b'panim. That can be on all levels. So generally, when we do mitzvahs here, we increase in the higher worlds, especially in Gan Eden. And as I said, Gan Eden on all levels, no matter where you go. That's how I would explain it. Okay. So I'm going to stop here at the end of the parentheses. I think it's a good place to stop. On page 12.